When I was 16, spring break was the most anticipated event of the year. My friends, Ryan, Mike, and I had saved up for months to afford a few days away from home. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a modest hotel by the beach, where we could swim, relax, and forget about school for a while. We were young and invincible, or so we thought. The first day was perfect. We checked into the hotel, dropped our bags in the room, and headed straight for the pool. It was late afternoon, and the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over everything. The pool was nearly empty, just a few other guests lounging nearby, enjoying the quiet evening. As we splashed around, laughing and joking, I noticed a figure at the far end of the pool. He was dressed in all black, with a hood pulled low over his face. Something about him made my skin prickle, but I shrugged it off, thinking it was just some guy trying to stay out of the sun. But as I swam closer, I realized he wasn't moving. He just stood there, staring at the water, his face obscured by the shadows. "Hey, you all right?" I called out, but he didn't respond. My heart rate picked up, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. Something was wrong. Ryan and Mike noticed the man too, and swam over to see what was going on. But before we could reach him, he turned and walked away, disappearing through the gate at the far side of the pool area. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, but the uneasy feeling lingered. "Probably just some weirdo," Ryan said, trying to brush it off. Mike nodded in agreement, but I couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach. We decided to grab some dinner at a nearby restaurant, hoping that some food would distract us. The place was packed, full of families and other spring breakers enjoying the night. We found a table near the window and ordered burgers and fries, the mood lightening as we started to joke around again. But then, I saw him, the same man in black standing outside the restaurant, staring directly at us through the glass. His hood was still up, casting his face in shadow, but I could feel his eyes boring into me. I froze, my appetite vanishing in an instant. "Guys?" "He's here," I whispered, my voice trembling. Ryan and Mike turned to look, their expressions shifting from confusion to concern. The man didn't move, didn't blink. He just stood there, like a statue watching us. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't care about the food anymore. I just wanted to be somewhere safe, somewhere that guy couldn't follow us. But Ryan, always the skeptic, shook his head. "Come on, man. It's probably just a coincidence. We're not gonna let some creep ruin our night." Mike agreed, though he didn't look so sure. Reluctantly, I stayed, but I couldn't focus on anything except that man outside. After what felt like an eternity, he finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the tension in my chest didn't ease. We finished our meal and headed back to the hotel, the uneasy feeling hanging over us like a cloud. By the time we got back to our room, it was nearly 10:30, and we were all exhausted. Ryan and Mike crashed on the beds, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every noise, every creak in the hotel, made my heart jump. About 30 minutes after lying down, I heard a noise. Something faint, like a rustling sound coming from outside our door. I sat up, straining to hear, but it was quiet again. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or the ice machine down the hall, and tried to go back to sleep. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, closer. I opened my eyes and froze. There, at the end of the bed, were two men, both dressed in black with hoods covering their faces. They stood silently, like shadows in the darkness, their presence suffocating the air in the room. For a moment, I was paralyzed, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Then, panic set in, and I screamed. A loud, desperate cry that echoed off the walls. One of the men lunged forward and clamped a hand over my mouth, muffling my screams. I tried to fight, kicking and thrashing, but he was too strong. The other man grabbed my legs, and together they started to drag me off the bed. Ryan and Mike were stirring now, groggy and confused. But before they could react, the men had me out the door, their grip like iron. My vision blurred, the fear and adrenaline overwhelming my senses. I fought as hard as I could, but it was no use. The last thing I remember was the sharp pain in my side, a sudden, hot agony that stole the breath from my lungs. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling my nose. My side throbbed, bandaged tightly, and an IV was hooked into my arm. A nurse was sitting nearby, her face kind but serious. "You're awake," she said softly, relief in her voice. "You've been through a lot." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and raw. The nurse handed me a cup of water, and I sipped it gratefully, the cool liquid soothing my parched throat. "What? What happened?" I finally managed to croak. She explained that someone had heard my screams and called the police. They had arrived just in time to scare off the two attackers, who had fled before they could be caught. The knife wound I had suffered was serious, but not life-threatening. I was lucky, she said, but her words didn't bring me much comfort. Ryan and Mike were fine, though shaken. They had been in the room when the police arrived, too disoriented to understand what had happened until it was over. They had been there for me, even when I was unconscious, and that thought brought me some small measure of peace. But the men who had attacked me were still out there, their identities unknown. The police had no leads, no clues as to who they were or why they had targeted us. All they had left behind was a deep, gnawing fear that I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. To this day, I still wonder who they were, those men in black. Why did they come after us? What did they want? I don't know if I'll ever have the answers, but the memory of that night haunts me, a shadow that lingers at the edge of my thoughts, and every time I close my eyes, I see them again, standing at the foot of my bed, waiting to drag me into the darkness. Growing up in a small town in Italy had its charm. The cobblestone streets, the familiar faces, and the slow, easy pace of life made it a perfect place to be a kid. My brother and I spent our days riding our bikes around the neighborhood, exploring every nook and cranny we could find. It was the late 90s, a time when we had the freedom to roam without a care in the world, or so we thought. There was one place, though, that always made us uneasy. It wasn't far from our home, just a block or two away. The house stood at the edge of a narrow road, its appearance as unwelcoming as the man who lived there. The grass in the yard was wild and overgrown, almost like a jungle that had been left to take over. Weeds choked the path to the front door, and the paint on the house was chipped and faded, as though time itself had forgotten about it. But it wasn't just the house that unsettled us. It was the man who sat outside it, day after day, rain or shine. He was always there, slouched in a battered camping chair, a bottle in his hand. His appearance was as unkempt as his yard, greasy hair, a grizzled beard, and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His eyes were sunken and hollow, and there was something about them, something cold and vacant, that sent shivers down my spine. We never knew his name, and we never wanted to. To us, he was just the creepy man who lived in the creepy house. Every time we rode our bikes past his place, we'd quicken our pace, our hearts beating a little faster, our breath catching in our throats. Sometimes he'd glance up as we passed, those dead eyes following us until we were out of sight. Other times he wouldn't even seem to notice us, lost in whatever dark thoughts occupied his mind. It became a routine, avoiding his gaze, speeding up as we approached his house, and letting out a breath of relief when we were past it. As kids, we didn't think much of it. He was just another strange adult in a world full of things we didn't yet understand. But the unease was always there, like a low hum in the back of our minds. We never talked about it much, my brother and I, but we both felt it, the sense of dread that clung to that place. Several years passed, and life moved on. We grew older, our bike rides became less frequent, and that house and its eerie occupant faded into the background of our lives. But then, in 1997, everything changed. I remember the day vividly. It was late afternoon, and the town was buzzing with the kind of energy that only comes when something big has happened. People were gathered in small clusters, talking in hushed tones, their faces pale with shock. My brother and I had just gotten home from school when our mother called us into the living room. She had the newspaper in her hands, her expression a mix of horror and disbelief. "Did you hear about the murder?" she asked, her voice trembling. We hadn't. We were just kids, more concerned with homework and video games than the news. But as she handed us the paper, I felt a cold dread wash over me. The headline was stark and chilling. "Man stabbed to death in neighboring house." And beneath it, the mugshot of the suspect, him, the man from the creepy house, the man who had watched us from his camping chair for years. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt my stomach twist in fear. It was him. There was no mistaking those cold, hollow eyes. The article said that he and another man had gotten into a fight, and it had ended in bloodshed. The man had been stabbed to death, right there in that house we had passed by so many times, not even a block or two from our own home. Suddenly, all those years of unease, of dread, made sense. We had been right to be afraid, even if we hadn't understood why. We had been riding our bikes past a man capable of murder, a man who had finally acted on whatever darkness lived inside him. And we had come face to face with him on countless occasions, never knowing just how dangerous he was. The news of the murder sent shockwaves through our small town. People who had always kept to themselves now locked their doors tighter, whispered more quietly, and avoided eye contact with strangers. For a while, it was all anyone could talk about. But as time passed, the story faded from the headlines, replaced by other news, other tragedies. But for me, it never really went away. Every time I pass by that house, I feel a chill run down my spine. The yard is still overgrown, though the house itself has been abandoned for years. It stands there, a silent reminder of what happened, of the danger that had been lurking so close to home. I still live in that town, and sometimes I wonder what happened to him. Is he locked up somewhere, serving a life sentence for the murder he committed? Or did he slip through the cracks, free to live out the rest of his days in some other forgotten corner of the world? I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to. But what I do know is that I'll never forget the feeling of his eyes on me, the way he watched us as we rode by, completely unaware of the monster we were so close to. It's a memory that will always make my skin crawl, a reminder that sometimes the things we fear most aren't just in our imagination. Sometimes they're real, and they're closer than we ever want to believe. It was one of those days where nothing seemed to go right. My car had broken down, leaving me no choice but to Uber to my doctor's appointment. This happened during COVID, and I'd just taken my first vaccine shot. I didn't have a bad reaction, but my arm did hurt more than normal. The doctor told me this was possible, but I just didn't expect to be in that much pain. By the time I was done, I was in a fair bit of pain, and all I wanted was to grab some ibuprofen from the nearby gas station and head home. It was broad daylight, and everything felt normal. The kind of routine, uneventful day that you never really expect to remember. After picking up the painkillers, I stepped outside the gas station and waited for my Uber. I stood near the entrance, scrolling mindlessly on my phone, hoping the ibuprofen would kick in soon. That's when I heard them. Two guys driving by in an old beat-up car, hollering out the window at me. I didn't look up. I didn't need to. It's not like this was an uncommon experience for a woman alone, even in broad daylight. I shrugged it off, pretending not to hear them. But then, the car slowed. My stomach tightened with a sense of unease. They didn't just slow, they reversed. The car backed up, and they pulled into the gas station parking lot, their eyes locked on me. My heart started to race, but I kept my face calm. I didn't want to show fear, didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd rattled me. I was about to step back inside the gas station trying to act nonchalant, when another car pulled in right in front of me. For a split second, I thought I was being cornered, panic rising in my chest like a wave. Two cars boxing me in? What the hell was happening? But then, I saw her. A much older woman in the driver's seat. She rolled down her window and in the most casual tone called out, "Come here, honey." I hesitated. I didn't know her, and the last thing I wanted to do was step into another stranger's car. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if this was some kind of weird setup, if she was in on it with them. But something in her eyes told me otherwise. There was a calm urgency in her voice as she spoke again. Quieter, but firmer this time. "I don't trust those guys. I saw them hollering at you, and I don't like it. You don't have to get in, but just stand by my car. Let's pretend we're talking." That's when I glanced back at the two men. They had stopped, just a few feet away now, sitting in their car, watching us. The way they looked at me was different from the usual catcalling nonsense. It was darker, more focused. And when they saw the older woman pull up, their expressions twisted. They were angry, visibly angry. Without thinking twice, I walked over to her car. We stood there, pretending to have a conversation like we were old friends. My heart was racing, but I tried to play along, nodding as she talked about random things, her grocery list, her grandkids, anything to keep the charade going. The two men in the car started shouting, their voices rising in frustration. They yelled at the woman, calling her names, cursing at her, telling her to mind her own business. But she didn't flinch. She just gave them this cool, measured look, like she'd seen this kind of behavior before, and wasn't about to back down. "Just ignore them," she said softly to me, her voice steady. "They'll go away." And she was right. After what felt like an eternity, the men finally revved the engine and sped off, tires screeching as they pulled out of the lot. The air was heavy with tension, and I felt like I'd been holding my breath the entire time. As soon as they were gone, I let out a shaky breath and turned to the woman. I told her I was waiting for an Uber and thanked her, probably too many times, for stepping in. She waved it off like it was no big deal. "Manette, I wasn't about to leave you here alone with them lurking around," she said, her tone matter of fact. "You don't know what people are capable of these days." She didn't know how right she was. Those guys weren't just the typical frat boys looking for a laugh. They were rougher, harder, gang members maybe, or something close enough to it that their presence alone had sent a chill down my spine. The woman stayed with me, keeping her car running until my Uber arrived. She even checked the driver's details on my phone to make sure it was the right car before she let me get in. I'll never forget how she smiled at me, reassuring but firm, and said, "You be careful now. Don't ever ignore your instincts." As we pulled out of the lot, I watched her fade into the distance, still parked there, her eyes following me to make sure I was truly safe. It wasn't until I got home and locked the door behind me that the full weight of what had almost happened hit me. My legs felt weak, and my hands trembled as I replayed the moment in my head, over and over again. What would have happened if she hadn't pulled up when she did? What if I had been alone when those guys decided to get out of their car? The thought gnawed at me, and it still does to this day. I don't know what those men wanted, and I don't think I ever will. But the memory haunts me. The way they looked at me. The anger when their plan was disrupted. The uncertainty of what might have happened. It terrifies me to know how close I came to something much worse. But I'll never forget that woman. A stranger stepping in when no one else would. She didn't ask for anything in return. She just wanted to make sure I was safe. And because of her, I was.